I'm Connor Old and welcome back to another episode of Forgotten Oscar Films. And this week we're going to be looking at the 1967 class of films, an Oscar year that I can't wait to talk about because it's such a fascinating year that I want to do my best job in just sort of a tight video talking to you about why the Oscar history is so important, but also why this film is so critical to film history in general. But if you're new to this series, what I do every single week is I look at a film that was nominated for Best Picture. We started with the year 1988 and we worked backwards, and I pick one that I think has maybe been forgotten, one that hasn't been as well remembered as before, or compared to some other movies that were nominated. You know, at the time this was sort of seen as the top 5 movies of the year, but yet sometimes some of these films aren't as recommended or have sort of been lost to time, unfortunately. So I give my Oscar thoughts on the history of the other 5 nominees because it's so crucial to understand that time period, but also I try to figure out my thoughts on the film and answer that central question as to why maybe it's been forgotten. Now, this year is such a famous year in Oscar history that I almost debated skipping it, but there's so much rich history that I wanted to talk about, even though I think the film, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the titular film, it really isn't forgotten necessarily, as is maybe sort of got lost in the crowd of some of these other more influential movies of that time, because like we've sort of been talking about throughout the 70s episodes and really into the 69, this year is sort of the first year of the new Hollywood. There have been books written by this, something like Pictures Out of Revolution by Mark Harris is a famous book written about this Oscar year and this sort of period, because this very much ushered a whole decade of new films and really a monumental shift and change in Hollywood, where we went from more studio pictures to more socially conscious pictures and gave more control to the directors. And that really started with some of these movies. Like Bonnie and Clyde or The Graduate. But let's go into the 5 nominees now. In the Heat of the Night was the eventual Best Picture winner. I actually almost did this one, but I want to talk about Norman Jewison next week with The Russians Are Coming, because he's the director we've sort of been evading for a while, and I want to do a sort of full episode dedicated to him in terms of the Oscar history aspect. It's a great movie. It's a very complex movie. A movie, like I said, I've already seen, and I think an important movie that you get people to watch. And I think this is one that it maybe has held up in terms of the way its complexities and the way it deals with race, and sort of not a super clean Hollywood style. That there's some more complexity to it. The Graduate, directed by Mike Nichols, very strange because it only won 1 award. I think it had like 7 nominations, but it won for Best Director. It didn't win anything else, just Best Director, which is strange, and it didn't go to Norman Jewison, maybe because he was sort of new at the time, and maybe because Mike Nichols had Nichols and May. He was part of that comedy duo for a few years, so they recognized him there. Hard to say that way. It's hard to say that it would win Best Director and then nothing else, especially because I think In the Heat of the Night won the DGA, so that's a little confusing. But The Graduate in itself is an amazing movie, a classic movie. Don't want to say too much more about that. Bonnie and Clyde, another sort of very much the controversial movie at the time, sort of the singular film that represented sort of the ideals very much in a blunt way. Warner Brothers was not confident in the film. They didn't even give it really a proper release, but due to critics and people just absolutely loving it, they put it back in theaters. It was just a critical and commercial movie that swept the nation by storm, and was the conversation everyone was talking about, because it just felt so radical at the time. And then we have Dr. Dolittle, which is the 4th nominee, which is maybe the film that has been least remembered. However, in a studio system nowadays in Hollywood where intellectual property, IP, is so important, I think Dr. Dolittle has been remade once and is being remade again with Robert Downey Jr. coming out next year. So I think I couldn't cover that just because, based on the fact that its intellectual property and its brand name recognition is maybe the highest in the general population, or more than anything, surprisingly. But this is a film that was a sort of a peak roadshow musical that was a failure in terms of critical success and even commercial success, yet still try to push for those Oscars. We talked a little bit about the Nicholas and Alexandra episode. We talked about a lot on the Anne of the Thousand Days episode, because Hello Dolly was sort of a signifier in terms of that death. And Dr. Dolittle was definitely one that we have all these great nominees and sort of this signifying aspect of New Hollywood, and then you have Old Hollywood sort of sneaking in from a movie that cost a lot of money, didn't make a lot of money. Critics didn't like it, people didn't like it. It was kind of ridiculous because there's all these things where even Oscar campaigning was going on there, where they would do special screenings for Oscar voters and treat them out to parties and feed them and stuff that's not necessarily explicitly allowed today, but is very much still more prevalent. And then our final nominee, the movie we're going to be covering, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which I think in a lot of ways, similar almost in a way to In the Heat of the Night, but very much more traditional in the sense that it's old-fashioned filmmaking, but with sort of new ideas. You know, we have something like the rear screen projection, but then you have these sort of new themes of you know, just the basic of the white woman. Obviously, the central conflict would be sort of the white woman bringing her black boyfriend to the white parents, and then vice versa later on in the film. And how that sort of can create conflict, especially at the time, because it really is a representation of New Hollywood and Old Hollywood. The older people sort of in the establishment, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy in his final role, unfortunately. One of my favorite actors, incredible. And then sort of the new generation with Hutton and Poitier. And Poitier, if you don't know, Sidney Poitier was sort of the first African-American star of real consequence in Hollywood, I would say, because in this film alone was really sort of this film and this year for him was a super crucial year. He had Just Sir with Love, he had In the Heat of the Night, which was the Best Picture winner, and then he had Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. So a monumental year. He'd won an Oscar 3 years earlier, becoming the first African-American actor to win a Best Lead Actor Oscar, of course, and he was only the second African-American to ever win an acting Oscar. Of course, before that was Hattie McDaniel in 1939 with Gone with the Wind for Best Supporting Actress. But with To Sir with Love, which was a hit, and then these two films were both nominated for Best Picture, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and In the Heat of the Night, they all dealt with race, and in a lot of ways Sidney Poitier was sort of a symbol for African-Americans at the time because of his prominence and how he really stepped onto the scene as sort of a strong leading man. And this was actually a very complex topic at the time because, you know, even something like Loving v. Virginia, which was portrayed in the movie Loving, that, you know, interracial marriage is still not really legalized in a lot of, I mean, it is in certain aspects, but certain things like interracial cohabitation is illegal in a lot of states when this is being released. So it's very much a film that felt of the time, yet still is sort of made in kind of an old-fashioned way. Like, there's so much more history that I can go over. I mean, Martin Luther King was shot, assassinated, excuse me, a couple days before the ceremony was supposed to happen, and they had to delay it about a week. So this is really a crucial time in American history and really in Oscar history, because this is sort of a transition into sort of the new Hollywood, but also the African American experience in the States, particularly, but with Sidney Poitier sort of in a way, and these movies and the themes that they're tackling being sort of a beacon of the new challenging themes that Hollywood's going to tackle in the future to come. So transitioning to my thoughts. So this is a movie that has actually enjoyed, I didn't necessarily love, but has some really great performances, particularly by the older actors. I think Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. I mentioned Spencer Tracy, one of my all-time favorite 20th century actors, and it's kind of ironic in the film because they're playing husband and wife, and while they weren't technically sort of husband and wife because Spencer Tracy never got divorced, they were living together in the last part of their lives, and were essentially married, but they weren't technically married, I guess. So it's kind of ironic there. Katharine Hepburn, of course, wins the Oscar for this movie, and really, I think it's those two, and then Sidney Poitier, of course, just an incredible, commanding, powerful performance in such a unique way that really only Sidney Poitier can do. There's this great sort of aspect where, you know, he's reserved in certain aspects, but he's just like sort of the passion, sort of just the honesty in his way really almost bleeds out on the screen when he's talking in these great scenes with his own father, or talking between Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. You know, the movie's filled with sort of little looks and nods, and that's what really allows them to excel in terms of their acting, because it's not necessarily an explicit word why you don't, you know, necessarily, the parents don't necessarily want their daughter marrying. Is it just because they don't want the daughter marrying a black guy, or is it just a guy in general, or because they just met in Hawaii? You know, what is it? And sort of, you know, I don't want to be racist, but it still kind of bothers me because, you know, it's still sort of a sensitive topic. and sort of that sort of debate. It's all to do with looks and, oh, you're the doctor, of course. It kind of plays out like a play, but I think there's some little movie aspects and those little facial recognition things that you wouldn't be able to connect with on a play, which is why I think a movie actually does serve a little bit better. And like I said, there's some great aspects and some great lines of dialogue. I guess sort of the main criticism of the film, which I kind of agree with, is that it's very predictable. You know what's going to happen at the end, and it just takes some time to get there because, well, we kind of know what's going to happen. But still, I think it goes into every avenue in terms of its predictability and sort of every aspect of the real issue that they're going to, and placing a time frame on it. It's kind of classic storytelling. But there's still other aspects where people have argued that Sidney Poitier literally has to be perfect. He's not necessarily a good representation of the culture. He has to be handsome and smart and a doctor and famous for them to accept him. But I do think that this is one of those situations where I'd rather. I think, in terms of general conversation mover and changer, I'd rather take it for a small step that gets to everyone than, just doing a small independent movie that's very radical and changes a couple people's lives a lot, but not sort of the large majority. And I think even something we see with Green Book nowadays is still an issue we sort of talk about, and an old-fashioned movie like that can win Best Picture. Because it's still a relevant kind of topic I think, our conversation, at least in North America, for sure. So why hasn't this been remembered? It kind of has. I mean, Get Out is a movie that came out a couple of years ago that directly references this movie. I mean, that dynamic is still there. But I think it's definitely a film that has been representative of a certain time period. It's a film that people maybe don't recommend as much because it's not maybe the most modern movie, or hasn't sort of held up in terms of pacing and how it talks about those themes, versus something that's a little bit more in your face. Even something like In the Heat of the Night, or any of Spike Lee's films we talked about, something like Do the Right Thing. But I do think that this film is still a good film to show, even as an introductory film, but it's definitely one of those films that hasn't necessarily been forgotten, but hasn't been well regarded in sort of passionate love for this film, just because I think is maybe some films that have been recommended, and these are some of people's favorite movies of all time, like The Graduate, and then some films are just sort of stuck in the history books, and that's sort of maybe where this one is, but that doesn't give it enough credit, because it really is a good film. And I think if you are interested in knowing more about this history, I think it's a crucial film to really understand, and a seminal film that I enjoyed watching. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your favorite 1967 movie. It was a great year for movies. That's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the episode. And until next time, stay tuned.